The outcast Jesus defended would shock you. We think of cancel culture as some new invention, that swift public takedown of anyone who steps out of line. But what if I told you that 2,000 years ago, one man was essentially canceled by the establishment because of the people he chose to defend? Long before our modern social media battles, Jesus of Nazareth was at the center of a firestorm for embracing the most despised people of his day. And the outcast he stood up for, they're not who you might think. We're about to uncover the forgotten stories of the people Jesus defended, why it made the powerful so furious, and what it reveals about his radical vision for humanity. 1. The unseen walls of Jesus' world. To really get how radical Jesus was, you have to picture the world he walked into. First-century Jewish society wasn't just a place. It was a complex system of social and religious purity. Think of it as a world of invisible walls, separating everyone into categories: clean and unclean, righteous and sinner, worthy and unworthy. And these weren't just social suggestions. They were deeply held beliefs, rooted in tradition and their understanding of God's law. At the very top, you had the religious elites, figures like the Pharisees and scribes. They saw themselves as the guardians of righteousness, and they meticulously avoided anyone or anything they considered unclean to protect their own purity. And at the very bottom, the outcasts. This wasn't just one group, but a whole collection of people pushed to the absolute edges of society. You had lepers who were both physically and socially untouchable. Their disease made them ritually unclean, forcing them into total isolation, cut off from family and community. People with certain illnesses or disabilities were often seen as cosmic sinners, their condition believed to be a punishment from God for some secret sin. Then there were the Samaritans. To the Jews in Judea and Galilee, they were historical and religious rivals, sort of like the ultimate frenemies but without the friend part. They were seen as having distorted the true faith and were not to be associated with. And maybe the most hated of all? Tax collectors. These were Jewish men working for the Roman Empire, the foreign oppressors. They were seen as traitors, getting rich by extorting their own people. To even be seen with a tax collector was to betray your nation and your faith. The conventional wisdom of the day was clear. You protect yourself from wickedness by keeping your distance from wicked people. These walls were absolute. They decided who you could talk to, who you could eat with, and who was seen as beyond the reach of God's grace. To cross these lines wasn't just bad manners, it was spiritual contamination. It was a direct violation of the entire social order. And it was into this rigid, walled-off world that Jesus walked, ready to start tearing things down. 2. The inciting incident, a dinner with sinners. One story perfectly captures this clash of worlds. It's found in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Jesus is walking near the Sea of Galilee when he spots a man named Levi, you might know him as Matthew, sitting in his tax collector's booth. This wasn't just a guy at his desk. This booth was a symbol of everything the righteous despised: betrayal, greed, and Roman collaboration. So what does Jesus do? He doesn't lecture him. He doesn't shout at him from a safe distance. He looks at this total outcast and says two simple world-changing words: "Follow me." And Levi does. He gets up, leaves everything, and follows him. But the story doesn't stop there. That would have been scandalous enough. Nope, it gets better. That same day, Levi throws a huge party at his house to honor Jesus. And who are the guests? The Bible says it was a great crowd of tax collectors and others. Basically, a house full of people everyone else had labeled sinners. And right there in the middle of it all is Jesus, kicking back, sharing a meal. In that culture, eating with someone was a huge deal. It was an act of acceptance, friendship, and unity. It meant you were identifying with them, sharing life with them. By sitting at that table, Jesus wasn't just being polite. He was making a powerful public statement. He was declaring that these people, these traitors, these extortionists, these so-called sinners, were not outside his circle of care. He was welcoming them in. This was a direct sledgehammer to the social and religious walls of his time. 3. The fury of the establishment. The religious leaders were watching. And when the scribes and Pharisees saw this, they were appalled. But notice they didn't have the nerve to confront Jesus directly at first. Instead, they pull his disciples aside and start complaining, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" And look, from their point of view, it was a fair question. They were the spiritual gatekeepers. They believed their strict obedience to the law was what kept the nation pure and right with God. For them, holiness meant separation. You protect yourself from sin by avoiding sinners. What Jesus was doing seemed reckless, even dangerous. It looked like he was endorsing their lifestyle, and in their eyes he was becoming unclean himself. It was a flagrant violation of the purity rules that held their world together. This wasn't just about table manners. It was a fundamental clash over the very nature of God. They believed righteousness was a ladder you climbed by following rules and keeping your distance from the unholy. They saw God's kingdom as an exclusive club for the morally successful. Jesus' actions were a direct assault on their whole system. He was showing that their brand of righteousness, built on exclusion and looking good on the outside, wasn't God's righteousness at all. His entire ministry was a constant challenge to their hypocrisy, their focus on ritual over mercy, and their habit of locking the gates on anyone they deemed unworthy. This dinner was the perfect picture of that conflict. He wasn't just breaking a social rule. He was breaking their rules, and by doing so, exposing their system as spiritually bankrupt. 4. The climax/revelation, the doctor's diagnosis. Jesus overheard their grumbling, and his response is one of the most revolutionary lines in the whole Bible. He turns to the Pharisees and says, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick." Then he lands the punchline, "I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." Just let that sink in for a moment. With that one simple metaphor, Jesus flips their entire worldview upside down. The Pharisees saw themselves as spiritually healthy and everyone else as sick and contagious. To them, a holy person's job was to stay away from the sick to avoid getting infected. Jesus basically says, "You've completely missed the point." He frames himself as a physician. What's the purpose of a doctor? It isn't to hang out with healthy people. A doctor goes where the sickness is. A doctor's glory isn't in avoiding disease, but in healing it. By calling himself a doctor for the spiritually sick, Jesus declares that his purpose is not to condemn broken people, but to heal them. His mission is restoration, not exclusion. This was the core of his radical message. God's compassion extends to everyone, especially the outcasts. He taught that membership in God's family isn't based on your moral resume, but on God's kindness. His message was a massive expansion of ethics, moving beyond just caring for your own tribe to embracing everyone, even your enemies. In that moment, at a dinner party full of despised people, Jesus revealed his vision for humanity, a kingdom not for the self-proclaimed righteous, but for the self-aware sick who know they need a doctor. 5. Expanding the circle, the other outcasts. And this dinner? It wasn't a one-time thing. It was his signature move. Again and again, Jesus intentionally crossed social, religious, and cultural lines to embrace the outcasts. Think of the Samaritan woman at the well. A respectable Jewish man would never speak to a woman alone in public, let alone a Samaritan woman with a complicated past. But Jesus starts a conversation, dives into a deep theological discussion with her, and reveals who he is. He offered dignity to someone who was expecting judgment. Or consider the lepers. In one story, a leper comes to Jesus begging to be healed. By law, just being near this man was a problem. But Jesus does the unthinkable. He reaches out and touches him. He willingly takes on the man's unclean status in order to make him whole. That touch was as powerful as the healing itself. A radical act of kindness for a man who probably hadn't felt another person's touch in years. The list goes on. He allowed a woman known as a sinner to anoint his feet with expensive perfume, defending her from the sneers of his host. He blessed the poor, declaring the kingdom of God belonged to them, turning the whole idea of success on its head. He even went to the home of Zacchaeus, a chief tax collector, a man who was an expert at betraying his own people for profit. Each of these moments was a living parable. Jesus showed that God's love doesn't have a waiting list or a worthiness test. It actively seeks out the lost, the broken, and the rejected. 6. The ultimate challenge, what does it mean for us? So, why do these 2,000-year-old stories still feel so shocking? because they challenge us right where we live. Jesus' radical inclusion is a timeless answer to the universal feelings of loneliness, judgment, and exclusion that we all still face. And it forces us to ask a tough question. Has modern Christianity sometimes watered down this message? It's a heavy question, but many scholars and thinkers would argue that yes, it has. There's a tendency for institutions to build new walls, to cozy up to power structures, the very things Jesus stood against. We sometimes forget that Jesus was a friend to sinners not because he ignored sin, but because he saw the person behind the label and offered them a path to transformation through grace, not judgment. Let's be honest, what Jesus asks isn't easy. Loving our enemies and prioritizing the marginalized is still deeply countercultural. It's way easier to build comfortable communities with people who look, think, and act just like us. It feels safer to stand with the righteous than to sit with the sinners. But the model Jesus gives us is one of courageous love. It's a love that replaces judgment with curiosity and fear with compassion. It's a love that moves toward people, not away from them. And it leaves us with a question to reflect on. Where in my life am I building walls when Jesus was in the business of tearing them down? If this message of radical, unconditional love resonates with you, share this video with someone who might need to hear it. And for more deep dives into the challenging and beautiful teachings of Jesus, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss what's next. Conclusion. The outcasts Jesus defended weren't just a problem for the establishment back then. They are a challenge to us now. He showed us that God's kingdom is an upside-down one, where the last are first and the outsiders are invited to the center of the feast. His vision was for a new humanity reconciled to God and to each other, where the walls that divide us are finally destroyed. That vision of a radically inclusive family, bound together not by moral perfection but by a shared hunger for grace, is just as revolutionary today as it was 2 millennia ago. He treated the outcasts like family, reminding us that we were all once outcasts who have been brought home.